All right, well, I think that we will get started here. So thank you everybody for coming today. Our topic for today's AE² is actually just about origin support strategies. So we're going to talk about ways that we can reduce some risks in your build and how to best set up your build for some success. If you guys have any questions, feel free to add them in the chat and I'll probably answer them at the end. But to start off, I have a little couple slides I'll share just as I talk about some of the foundational things that we think about as we're setting up our build. Really where your support strategy is going to start from is from your material selection. Basically, each material is going to have its own material strength and its own set of properties like we know. But even beyond that, as it's printing, it's going to have a different set of properties compared to when it's fully cured at the end of the whole printing process. And that's what we would refer to as its green strength or its green state, is where it's partially cured as it's printing. Each green strength is going to be specific to each part in each material. And that's really going to determine how much support you're going to want on your part in addition to its orientation. So lower green strength materials are going to require some more support to make sure that they hold steady, especially when we're talking about elastomeric materials, but even semi-rigid materials, we can talk about that with too. So if it doesn't have enough support, it can tend to wobble as it's printing, and you might see shifts in your layer lines as it progresses through the part when it comes to this, if it's not supported well enough. And the reason why we get those wobbles in it is actually because of the Stefan adhesion and the forces that are exerted on the part. As it's on that build tray and it dips in and out of the resin, that part is going to be pulled away from the resin, but also towards the resin by the liquid and by that membrane that's being printed on at the bottom. So that's basically trying to tear this part off of your build tray, which can result in build failures. But we can reduce the risk of this by choosing appropriate support profiles, using your orientation to your advantage, and making sure that you have a raft or a brim on your part to really adhere it to the build tray. And now we can go into talking about GrabCAD, because that is one of the best ways to really start figuring out your origin support strategies that are going to work for you. Here we have GrabCAD, which is our print prep software, as I'm sure you know most of you guys know. But we have our Origin 2 selected here today, and I have a helical gear here to talk about first. When we look at each of your individual parts, that is going to really determine your support strategy based upon what your critical surfaces are. When I look at a gear like this, I consider the teeth to be probably the most critical part of this object. We really don't want any supports generated in between the teeth because we don't want anything in there that can interfere with that interlock between teeth of different gears. So when we look at this, we would typically start by pulling in our part, first off selecting your material. I have 3172 selected for this, which is a pretty good all-arounder high-impact material, and it's got some moderate green strength. And one way that you can find out about the green strength of your material is by checking out material processing guides available through Stratasys. And when we get in here, we would look at our model settings, and we make sure we choose the support profile that's correct for this. I typically choose either rigid or a light tough option, but I would go with rigid for this. I find that it works the best. And then after we make sure that those are correctly selected, I always check our support settings every time that I import an object. That's one of the most surefire ways to sabotage your build, is if you don't check that the right one is selected and it generates the incorrect support structure for your material. But now we can talk about our orientation. And one nice thing about GrabCAD is that we have some automatic orientation options here. So the two main options that I would use would be either the max reliability or potentially our or our minimum supported area. Looks like my camera has gone out here, which that's okay. We're just going to deal with that right now. But our minimum supported area is something that can potentially cause issues for us as we're printing, because it actually minimizes the amount of support that's going to be on your part, and that minimizes the amount of anchoring that we have from the part to the build tray. That being said, it can be really nice for minimizing your post-processing work after your print is completed. If we're looking at something where we want the maximum reliability, we'd choose something like 45 degrees because this allows the layers to really stack on top of each other, but it does tend to add more supports to your part, and that can make post-processing a bit more painful. For this part, because I really want those teeth to be nice and refined, I don't want to change it from its original orientation, so I would hit reset here. Our next thing that we would consider is our anchor points. So if we just go based off of our standard settings here and we generate our anchor points, we can see from our bottom view that some of them get generated really close to the teeth on the edge, which can be just fine. But when we look at it after our support is generated, again, just with our standard settings, you can see that sometimes there are little supports that are generated just enough between these teeth, just high enough that it can cause interference with your part and with those interlocking mechanisms. So I would go through and manually delete them, which is just a shift click option. This can be a little bit time consuming, but it is really worth it to check, especially for parts like this where there are so many teeth. If we just go through, there's only a few to really edit, but after you make any edits to automatically generated supports, you have to go and you have to generate your support again, so that way we can see that that support is actually removed. Another way that you can reduce time manually editing them is by going to your anchor point options, and you can increase your border offset from our standard, which is 12 thou. We can increase that, and that would actually increase the distance from this outer edge here that these supports would be generated, and ideally push it inwards. Another way to make your supports easier to remove is to reduce our tip diameter, which that reduces the interface of the support strut itself and the part. So that reduces that diameter and makes it much easier for those supports to peel off, but that can also really weaken the bond between the part and the surface that it's adhered to. If we look at the bottom here, we can see really all of these little supports have little tiny touch points at the bottom, which can be great, but it can also cause some issues when it is really not enough surface area to hold on to for that part, and it can still be peeled away from the build tray. So to avoid that, I add a raft to every one of my parts that are lifted off of the build tray. This makes it a lot easier to, one, get up and under your part without damaging the edges of it. This has a chamfered edge where you can just peel your scraper under there and pull it off. And it makes it so that you can pull off all of these supports all at once, which I find to be far worth my time. And I find it to be really helpful, even though it does use slightly more material. The contrary, or I should say the complement to this, if you have a large flat part that you can actually print directly on your build tray, would be using a brim. So if you're printing something like an injection mold like this, you can see it's a pretty big part, flat edges, it's all flat at the bottom. And actually, we already have brim generated on it. This white part here is that brim, but it extends this bottom surface by a millimeter or so, and it adds extra surface area to make sure that it adheres better to the build plate and does not peel away as the build tray is retreating from the resin. This really adheres your part to your tray, increasing your build success. And I think that this is a super helpful tool where we would just select our part, go over here to our raft and brim tool, select a brim, and generate it that way. The only downside to this is that it can potentially affect your diameter, or I should say your measurements of your part. But that being said, you can clip it away or file it away once it's done, which is what I typically do. But this also helps prevent part curling in rigid materials like RG3280, which is what we'd be printing this one out of. So I think that that's really all that I have today for you guys. So I'm going to stop sharing our screen here. But if you guys have any questions, please feel free to either unmute yourself or drop them in the chat, and I'm happy to go over any of them. Yes, so you can stack origin parts. This is a Print Pro feature, actually, a GrabCAD Print Pro feature, but you can stack your parts both in X and Y and then in Z. The thing to consider with this is that it does use more support material and it can potentially take more time to remove your parts from the support nest that it creates, but it's a great way to use your overnight time for builds and even weekend time. And if you guys have any topics too that you think would be great for our AE² series, please feel free to put them in the chat or send them to any of us here. I think that that's a great way for us to make sure that these are really customized to you. And I think which materials are the easiest to print with? I would personally say that ones that have higher green strength are the ones that are easiest. Of course, you usually choose a material based upon your intended application. But if you're really just looking to learn the system, I would start off with something like ST45. It gives me really consistent builds, and it is at an easier price point for you to learn. But if you're looking for something with a bit more heavy duty purpose behind it, I would choose Loctite 3843, which I think is an excellent all-rounder material. And it really turns out beautifully with basically every print. Yeah, I think these are some good things that I do that really help me as I'm building. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. I love to help people with their origin prints. So if you have any questions, we're always happy to help and we're always here for you.